Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all the participants of the session, organizing team of IFLA-APR and my colleagues from ISOLA India. IFLA-APR has been conducting the Talk and Share series webinar, which is bringing in diverse topics related to the profession of landscape to the forefront. On behalf of Indian Society of Landscape Architects, I really thank IFLA-APR to have given us this opportunity to conduct this session today under this banner. A quick introduction to ISOLA. We are landscape professionals body with 10 chapters across the country. The center looks at overall operations and functioning, collaborations with other professional bodies to create platforms for our members. The various verticals include education board, research grant committees, membership committee, etc. We have biannual conferences, symposiums, ISOLA awards, and we recently have launched the research grant to support short-term researches for the individuals and our members. We engage with the student body by conducting workshops and competitions for the undergraduate students. What keeps the pace going is its chapters, which takes initiatives to engage regionally, locally, and spread the work of landscape professionals across. This very session is one such chapter led event by Gujarat chapter team who has actively curated the theme and the panel here. Moving towards today's session and the introduction to the overarching theme of today on ecologies of care, people, place, and shared futures. Landscape is in India has always existed as inherently dynamic web of relationships shaped through use, lifestyle, and everyday practices, labor, ritual, and continuous negotiations between landscapes and people. These landscapes have evolved as living habitats dependent on ecological networks. They cannot be easily abstracted from everyday life or detached from the communities that inhabit them, nor can they be assigned a singular function. A pond is not only a water body, a grazing ground is not only a open space. A forest is not simply a resource. These are deeply embedded utilitarian landscapes that sustain communities while simultaneously being cared for by them. It is through these relationships that we begin to understand the idea of commons. The commons, therefore, is beyond just a resource that is collectively available. It encompasses knowledge, practices, memory, and social relationships, along with the ecological resources and services that nature provides, together forming emergent and circular systems of sustenance and exchange. And perhaps this is where the idea of care becomes important. These relationships need to be strengthened and nurtured, understanding the embedded role in everyday lives of the communities, leveraging upon their interconnectedness and to make them relevant to contemporary societies. This panel is curated based on this premise, with sub themes as more than human commons, which spreads the discourse beyond human centered understandings of landscape. Within this, further, we look into the practices of commoning, shifting attention to commoning as an active social process, and then to traditional knowledge systems, which zooms in further to examine diverse ways in which communities have historically understood, adapted to, and shaped the landscapes. We bring together varied professionals and thinkers whose work positions landscape architecture as a discipline that mediates between the three themes. All of them are various attributes to the commons. We shall proceed now to listen to the panelists who will respond to the theme. We have 20 minutes for each panelist, followed by question answers and discussions. Allow me a minute to introduce Rushika, our first speaker, before I hand over to her. Rushika is a landscape architect, educator, and co-founder of Public Landscape and Urban Studio Plus. Her work explores wild ecologies and the ways in which their patterns and processes can inform contemporary landscape practice. She leads Terra Wild, a design practice, research cell, and indigenous plant nursery dedicated to advancing plant place responsive approaches to planting in India. I welcome you, Rushika, to initiate the session with your presentation and over.
Thanks, Maithili, for the introduction. I'm just going to screen share now. I hope my screen is visible. Okay.
Yes.
So, good evening. That was a nice introduction from Maithili. I'm here to represent the works of Plus and the TerraWild project. Plus is a collaborative practice that seeks to blur the boundaries between different design disciplines to create sustainable, innovative, and socially conscious landscape design that is accessible to all. Our team brings together a diverse skill sets of expertise without which projects of the nature that I'm going to be displaying would not be possible. Aridaman, who is the founder, has provided a platform for young professionals like myself and the rest of the team to explore and build our practice through research inquiries. My own personal journey began by being mentored by Mohan sir, who is also here today. And I thank Inde for the invaluable exposure they have provided me in my formative years and shaped the way I think about the profession today. During my master's, my inquiry into the role of urban wilderness in Indian cities began to take root. What started as a seed of an idea in my academic work grew further through a fellowship and later through a deeper engagement with teaching and research. Over the past 9 years, I've continued to study, write about, and explore local and indigenous wildscapes and wild waterscapes alongside students and research assistants. Working with them and engaging with different like minded professionals has continually kept my own curiosity alive. Their questions and their perspectives have often inspired me to look closer, seek further, and explore more. It is this continuing inquiry that brings me here today. I'd like to share some of our ongoing research into rewilding Indian cities, projects that, in different ways, are asking a fairly simple question. How can we bring the intelligence of wildscapes back into everyday landscapes of our city? Across urban India, ecology is steadily losing ground. Forests shrink, lakes disappear, and landscapes lose their ability to hold water, regenerate soil, and support life. And yet, our cities often appear very green. But much of this greenery is highly managed, irrigated, and largely ornamental. It may look lush, but ecologically it is often disconnected and hence performs very little, adding more stress to an already highly modified landscape. Planting futures began with a fairly straightforward intention. But very quickly, we realized that there was a much larger knowledge gap around what a sustainable urban landscape actually means in the Indian context. Ecological knowledge exists, but much of it remains inaccessible to the everyday gardener. Hence, we thought of a way we could implement change, especially as landscape architects, thinking of minimal gestures that could bring big impacts. And hence, we decided to talk about the future of planting in Indian cities. In India, rewilding is a theme picking up pace, with great precedents setting the scene for progressive methods. This initiative, for the larger part, remains largely associated with forests or protected landscapes, nature parks outside or within city boundaries, and are often large in size and scale. In contrast, the everyday city, our homes, streets, terraces, institutions, and neighborhood parks remain predominantly outside this conversation, a scale almost left to battle its own grounds. Planting future therefore asks whether rewilding can be democratized and can whether thousands of these small urban landscapes collectively become part of a larger ecological network. We began testing this particular idea in Bengaluru in collaboration with A-Tree as our knowledge partners. The project operates through three interconnected components: research, planting tools, and outreach, all spread out in different phases with overlapping efforts. We decided to begin thinking of a bottom up approach to tackle the problem, allowing our urban gardens and gardeners to embrace rewilding, thinking of ways we could allow the city to no longer be an isolated, distraught entity of aesthetics at the forefront, but a stepping stone in the larger matrix, ecologically and culturally responsive. But to understand Bengaluru's ecology, strangely, we had to leave the city we know today. We traveled backwards in time through maps and traced history, looking at Bengaluru's changing environs and impressions. The Garden City is an image engraved from the colonial hangover, But there was much more to Bengaluru than that, much more than the grand towering rain trees that often capture our visual gaze. Within the city, much of the original ecological character has been obscured. Roads flattening the otherwise rugged landscapes and dense urban fabrics expanding in all directions. So we expanded our field of view beyond political boundaries and into ecological zones in search of wilderness to beguile us and to reveal the point in the larger system that Bengaluru sits within. We began reading systems of climatic impacts, of rain shadow regions, and wind patterns. We peered into the physiography and understood different landscape settings. We further understood the terrain, an inverted bowl draining the water out, and the soil, geology, surface water, and aquifers that orchestrate the landscapes above. Forest and faunal diversity owing their presence to this subsurface ecology, and cultural constructs that engineered and modified the landscape to benefit a thriving civilization. We further proceeded to slice through the Bengaluru city to assess the changes in the landscape character to ascertain how different the city tends to be from the baseline of its indigenous ecologies. While doing this, one term became particularly evocative through our readings. The Bayalusime, in the local language, translated to an open country, a landscape that is horizontal, sparse, rocky, and seasonal. It was a contrast to the reassembled image of the city today. It reminded us that Bengaluru's ecological identity isn't necessarily lush or green. It can also be dry, open, and incredibly resilient. So we began treating these surviving indigenous landscapes as living classrooms. We traversed to places around the city that could give us clues of indigenous ecologies, acting as our labs or reference sites. Across scrublands, woodland savannas, sponge landscapes, and dry deciduous woodlands, we encountered completely different strategies for survival. Instead of studying individual plants in isolation, we observed communities, what grows together, what disappears during drought, what returns with rain, and what survives without irrigation. What are the building blocks of the landscape? How do fauna and flora together seed a landscape? Can we foster habitats when we structure our landscapes? And what is the underlying USP, if I may call it so, of these ecosystems? And what about their intelligence can we carry forward? And when we compared one of these reference landscapes with a conventionally designed urban park, the difference was striking. The indigenous landscape demonstrated a plethora of plant and animal life, operating largely within the water that was available to it, whereas the ornamental landscape depended heavily on irrigation and maintenance, even though it had fewer species to tend to. So it made us ask, what do we mean when we want to rewild cities? So the next challenge was translation. How could these landscapes inform something as ordinary as a home garden? Could we have inspiration to attract wildlife, to build healthy soil, to conserve water, to create microclimates, or to simply create a low maintenance garden? We developed four thematic frameworks derived from Bengaluru's reference sites, inspired by the mosaic of ecosystems shaped by elevation, geology, and water movement. To demonstrate the heterogeneity of our landscapes, I'll showcase just a few archetypes that were found in the dry Deccan garden. Here we see the ridge, scrub, and thorn forest encapsulating succulent boulder traps. These are tough, sun-beaten systems. They survive with almost no water, yet support pollinators, birds, and soil health. These are the true climate champions of the region. The scrub savanna mosaic shows a balance between grasses and shrubs. It's a dynamic landscape constantly renewing itself. These systems give us lessons in resilience. The rocky vernal pools appear only for a few weeks a year and then disappear. They show us that the pulse of seasonal life and reveal how temporary ecosystems also support long term resilience. Xeric shrublands showcase hardy plants interspersed with annuals, giving back enough biomass. The dry deciduous woodlands demonstrate how trees adapt to stress. Seasonal leaf litter enriching soils, root systems finding space between the cracks of boulders, and so on. The other vignettes that we shortlisted follow similar suit. The rain garden catering to the wetland and tank ecosystems that are strewn all across our region. The shade garden for altered and introduced microclimates and borrowed from the semi-evergreen and dry deciduous forests. And the pollinator garden for a low, sunny, flowering burst of scrub vegetation. We began assembling plant combinations across scales in the urban matrix and prepared viable plant lists for each theme through an indexing system, of course, that could work for urban conditions. But we also surveyed home gardens to understand what people actually want: flowers, fragrance, food, shade, butterflies, and familiar plants, of course. So rather than separating ecology from culture, we began bringing them together using edible, medicinal, aromatic, and culturally familiar plants alongside species selected for these ecological values that we are trying to familiarize everybody with. Because historically, we haven't experienced plants simply as visual objects. In India, we have always lived with them. We have fostered an ecology of care with them. So we started pulling out stories around the plants that we shortlisted, and we started to associate beyond ecology. The Honnemara, for example, is a tree by which Bengaluru is also supposedly named in some of the stories that we've read. The wood was used to make vessels with medicinal properties from the leaves, barks, and fruits. Now, this brings us to the first phase of the research that we have been working on. It has been a 5 year long journey, and the sixth year, we're hoping that the implementation actually takes place. The first phase is a three-part guidebook. The first booklet helps people to understand Bengaluru's ecology, familiarize themselves with the landscape through readings, a timeline of events, relevant maps, and field studies. The second booklet introduces approximately 200 to 250 suitable plants in the form of plant cards and cultural narratives. These plant cards provide for a one stop information hub required for urban gardeners to acquaint themselves with the plants. The third becomes a planting toolkit, providing practical planting combinations that can be adapted to balconies, terraces, homes, and larger landscapes, more like a do it yourself kit. So the journey moves from understanding the landscape to knowing the plants to actually planting them. But a book alone could not change the landscape. So the second phase is Greens on Wheels, a mobile nursery and outreach program that takes these ideas directly to neighborhoods, institutions, parks, and public events. It acts like a traveling showcase of these plants and a display of the research that helped curate this. This initiative is funded by a grant provided by BSF and NCBS, as well as the Narayan Family Foundation Trust. From the larger repository of the plant list that we curated, we champion a smaller group of plants and disseminate them to the public. Here we combine ecological value with adaptability, ease of maintenance, and a range of different plant habits. So we're trying to move beyond just trees that are available in nurseries in larger quantities, but also to look at shrubs, herbs, grasses, succulents, aquatics, riparian ed species, etc. We would also display demo gardens at sites where these pop up nurseries would be stationed for residents to visualize a new urban garden and appreciate these kind of aesthetics that the wild plants bring. So the idea is simple: bring indigenous plants to people and turn curiosity into adoption. The Greens on Wheels platform shall also be made available as a website to track the supply chain and availability of plants in the neighborhood, along with other interactive features, and also providing for planting recipes to help equip urban gardeners to put up these plants as simulations. But Green on Wheels also exposed another problem, a chicken and egg cycle of sorts. So, even when people want indigenous plants, where do they buy them from? So, our nursery survey showed that many of these species simply do not enter conventional horticultural supply chains. And this made us realize that creating demand isn't just enough. We have to work on propagation and the availability. So, this led us to the creation of Terra Wild nurseries. Rather than imagining one central nursery with all the plants being propagated, we're trying to develop a distributed network of growers, institutionals, partner nurseries, and satellite nurseries. So, our aim is to support the propagation through ecological guidance, research, documentation, and capacity building as initial support, eventually creating a living repository and an exchange network for indigenous plants. But once we have these plants, another question even further emerges. Can we develop a framework or methodology to design with the landscape, to build further on what it already has to offer? So here we return back again to the wild landscapes, but this time specifically to catalog processes. The ambition is to learn from systems that achieve complexity with relatively little human intervention. and ask how these lessons might inform lower maintenance and more resilient urban planting. And this leads us to the larger methodology that we're developing through Terra Wilding, which is to read the land and extract its language. So we began cataloging all our landscapes that were around us in the form of a booklet. And we hope that this particular publication should also be out pretty soon. To read the land and extract its language is also something that we're doing. Instead of treating planting as a static composition of objects, Terra Wilding asks us to design with processes, with succession, competition, regeneration, disturbance, seasonality, and time. So it starts to change the question from what should this garden look like to how should this landscape behave. And this in turn has started to feed thoughts in our practice as well, especially with planting design and the establishment of gardens and other restorative efforts. We first seek inspiration, as you can see, and then we simulate progression and probabilities, and then we further build a vision. We experiment with seed mixes, with dynamisms, with the rhythms that are found in wildscapes, and we try to recreate gardens that are co authored by the land itself. And this is perhaps where all these different projects come together, the ones that I have been trying to showcase. Planting Futures builds ecological knowledge, Greens on Wheels takes it to people, Terra Wild Nurseries begin building the plant supply, and Terra Wilding translates these lessons back again into design. So perhaps rewilding our cities doesn't begin by simply creating more green. It begins by learning to read the landscapes we already have and allowing their intelligence to inform the landscapes we create next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rushika, for this wonderful presentation and taking this thought through a 5 year journey and bringing it to us in this format. Thank you, and I really appreciate your work. We'll come back to you with the question answer round again.
All
Uh,
right.
we move on to our uh, second speaker, Mohan S. Rao, an environmental design and landscape architecture professional, is the principal designer of leading multidisciplinary consultancy practice, Integrated Design, Inde, based in Bangalore. His core expertise is in the field of environmental design, regional planning, and landscape architecture, with a strong focus on sustainable practices in the city and regional planning, disaster management, heritage conservation, and master planning. He is involved in research and design programs in the subcontinent, China, France, Italy, Morocco, and Libya. Over to you, sir. You can initiate your presentation.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, IFLA, for this platform to share thoughts and ideas. If my screen is visible, I get started straight away. The topic that somehow was handed over and evolved was around the idea of commoning. And commoning the everyday landscape is how I'm positioning this. So the first 3 or 4 slides looks at the larger philosophical idea of commoning, and here I would like to make this provocation quite strongly that there is a strong misconception on the very idea of commons, not just from a technical definition perspective, but as professionals engaged in spaces and experience across scales, whatever is seen as a public space is also misconstrued as a common, and or commons are also seen as rural artifacts removed from the development paradigm of the everyday. And this can be problematic for from many perspectives, but one of the most critical issues here is where the commons are seen as simply a pool of natural resources, which actually negates and even erases the intricate relationships that society and culture has with nature, especially in traditional societies that we see in the Asian context. So it's important to understand that the idea of commoning is to be seen as a practice of inhabitation that includes, of course, not just social, cultural, and agricultural practices, but also of how it defines one's relationship with nature itself. And in, in the current context, it actually becomes all the more important to be able to engage with this issue in a more detailed manner, because this also forms some of the most basic frameworks around which ideas of resilience and vulnerabilities can be defined, especially in the context of climate change and development challenges. So what I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes is to be able to look at different cases. I never think of any of these works as projects. It's always processes that allows different kinds of provocations, different kinds of explorations. And here we're using some of these frameworks on the idea of commons and commoning in understanding how it helps structure a certain process or help define a certain outcome. So one of the first ones that we are looking at is a rural campus in southern Karnataka. And one of the very basic things around the idea of commoning is for us to willfully erase the idea of a site. When I say use the term site, I mean it from the perspective of a defined property, which is our area of action. Because the very idea of commons is not just managing the resources, but also establishing its relationships to the larger environment. And in this particular case, we could be looking at fairly diverse set, and not just diverse, but often conflicting set of challenges that helps define these things, right from microclimate amelioration to livelihood issues to land and health systems. So it's the beginning of the process in this case is to be able to pool together all these very extremely diverse set of influences and parameters, but also help create a framework in which there can be some rational evaluation. I use the term rational very carefully. This is not a reductive approach where each is minimized to its lowest common denominator, but to be able to understand the inside out and the outside in process of development. And we use the term development carefully to include conservation and environmental protection on one end of the spectrum to human-centered infrastructure development at the other end. So key to these understandings and engagement with the idea of commons is, of course, traditional knowledge systems. And needless to say, all of our geographies across Asia, Africa, Latin America are extremely rich with these very diverse sources of traditional knowledge that could span pharmacology to dietary practices to habitation to every other practice. And that, of course, brings us to the idea of the designed space or the inhabited space. Design is again a very loose word in how we understand it, but the idea of engagement is that when we started, I mentioned the idea of breaking the outline of the site or erasing the legal confines of a site, which means that one is able to re-establish all the relationships, not just ecological flows, but social and cultural as well. And these then help us understand not just the potential of the land or the vulnerabilities of the land, but it also helps form a distinct framework that can address very diverse and very conflicting issues of environment protection and development in a more sustained manner. And through this process is the actual process of inhabitation that begins within quote unquote the site, which is the legal confines. The The learnings, the explorations, the provocations happen from the larger region, but the actual stage of engagement still remains within the legal confines of the site. And again, when we are looking at the idea of engagement, it is not a fixed design language or a design statement that is brought out, but a process that continues to evolve. In fact, in this case, the entire process was conceived as that of a living lab, so that one continuously learns from one's own actions and is able to create corrective mechanisms to address any challenges and any changes that would need to come out. This includes core activities that will address, let's say, for example, livelihood generation, to nutritional challenges, to reincorporating traditional knowledge systems. So there could be a diverse set of challenges that of course includes the built fabric equally, because any of these approaches cannot really create a distinction between the constructed and the designed to the natural world, which is one of the challenges that everyone in the profession frequently faces. So each of those elements, whether they're meant for personal action or community action, this is not seen as a matter of consumption of the space, but of co-creation of the space between the different actors. And the outcome is what one sees as an continuously evolving and dynamic landscape with some direction of desired outcome, but not necessarily a particular action that is celebrated as the final picture. In another example, we are going to be looking at a extremely contrasting space. So the idea of sharing these diverse set of examples is also to see how the very process of commoning of landscape changes the framework and the approach depending on the landscape that one is engaging with. The first one that we saw was a fairly vulnerable, disaster-prone, dry, deciduous, drought-prone area, whereas the example that we are going to be seeing now is equally vulnerable, but more from floods and cyclones uh, with extremely high vulnerabilities on both land and water systems. So here the learning is more interesting also because it spans several hundred, if not thousands of years of the ways in which humans have shaped this landscape. Literally, the idea of inhabitation of the land starts from carving out a land where none exists. This is not the same as reclamation of a bay that we see in a modern metropolis, but this is patient engineering and patient crafting of the land across millennia that has helped create this land across the mangroves. This is along the Bay of Bengal, the estuaries of the Ganga and the Brahmaputra rivers, one of the largest deltaic landscapes on the planet, also the largest mangrove. So what's interesting is it's not just the water system that is dynamic in this case, but even the land and the land systems continue to remain very, very dynamic. So learning from these actually helps create very specific parameters in understanding both creation of the land and management of the water, which actually can help the necessary paradigms for development within the area of engagement. While the learning, like I said, comes from the commons, but the lessons learned and its application actually helps create more commons even within smaller private spaces. Given that this was meant for a very specific kind of user group, which was people under the spectrum, and it is a highly vulnerable landscape, it means that very large systems spread across hundreds of square kilometers needed to be understood, appreciated, studied before their knowledge system could be applied on smaller sites. And that engagement includes looking at 100-year data on storm surges, to typhoons, to cyclonic storms, which gradually helps evolve again a dynamic master plan. Dynamic in the sense of how land and water are allowed to move through the space while allowing a firm ground for humans to inhabit in the form of buildings, playgrounds, houses, community spaces. So the next few slides that you will see is a very quick look at the transition of the land and the landscape across two seasons, two monsoons. Everything crafted using completely passive measures with not an ounce of cement going into any construction. But what's interesting is not just the crafting of the land, but the extremely dynamic nature of the same piece of land across seasons. And here, the lines that are drawn are merely guides. They're not defining lines that separate out the space for land and water, but they that merely guide these dynamic resource flows to shape the land that one needs to inhabit in the long term. Using a very different uh, paradigm of thinking, when we start looking at a much larger landscape, and in this case, it is a very sacred landscape that has been, held sacred by uh, people in the subcontinent across 12 centuries as per documentation, and oral traditions say across 2 millennia. But the idea here was to be able to understand the landscape not just from its material construct or the material evidence, as one has been, trained to do, but also to look at all aspects of the intangibility of that landscape. Landscapes that have been shaped by humans through the different values they assign to it, as well as the way in which humans respond to the natural dynamicity of this environment. So the when you actually put together the many different layers that form the morphology of this city region, again it's on the Bay of Bengal in eastern India, one is able to appreciate the multiple layers that goes into forming the space as it has evolved across 1500 years, but also in terms of how it is responded to by humans and held sacred by for various belief systems, for various sects, for various rituals across the entire landscape and across the year. So one is actually able to trace back the morphology of both the natural and the built habitat through different readings. The different readings sometimes are limited to the physical expressions, the material culture, and sometimes are the intangible, the oral cultures and the sacred cultures. So layering of a large city region landscape using these multiple readings actually helps us not just appreciate the various aspects of the landscape, but also gives very, very valuable and very critical clues in the ways in which one can engage with such a landscape, be it in terms of urban planning and zoning, be it in terms of actually understanding open spaces and water management, or its response to uh, extreme weather events. So bringing together the ideas of sacred and profane spaces within the city and how that has been created across millennia also then helps us map a certain route for the future, not just as a master plan, not just as a built development, but as a direction for all development in the future. The last example that we will look at is to see if there is really any value in looking at the ideas of commoning, the ideas of traditional knowledge systems, the ideas of ecological approaches to management in addressing contemporary urban challenges. And this is always seen as two ends of a spectrum. Either you can look at environmental conservation or you can look at development, seems to be the received wisdom. But the idea here is to see how does one look at the same city that Rushika was talking about earlier, which is Bangalore, but to be able to look at it from a much deeper history, starting from the geological history to the topography to hydrology, to see what are those forces that shaped the city, but equally importantly, what are those forces that are in need of very specific response, be it in terms of conservation or development. Is it possible to create a set of responses that is extremely site specific, but also derived from a larger set of behavioral principles without making the process reductive or limiting in any way? So the ideas of urban open spaces, be it from environmental vulnerability perspective or merely as a recreational open space perspective, will have inherent values for each of the system. It could be from merely a spatial access for recreation to ecological restoration at the other end. But the idea was to see how well can one develop robust systems based on deep understanding and analysis that can create specific frameworks that can guide all future development. So, and extending this idea not just from the physical, but in the same city that has this extremely rich natural heritage. How have humans responded to it across a millennia? Bangalore itself has a recorded history of about 1200 years. And it's interesting to see that there are various spaces, artifacts, characteristics of the landscape that are inherent to the celebration of the culture of the place. That could, from a very mundane part, could be the direct dependence for livelihood, to the spiritual on the other end of the spectrum. Each of these natural spaces start being embedded in the everyday ritual, the cultural narratives, the oral histories of the space. So the same city looked at from a modern urban planning perspective can look as simplistic as this, which simply shows how humans habitate the place as housing, as commercial space, and as open space. But if we were to inhabit the same space with all the cultural nuances that happens every single day on these urban areas, even in the present day, the way one starts reading the landscape can change quite dramatically, where natural systems are not just confined within the stated boundaries of urban planning systems, but are actually seen as dynamic networks that pass through the entire city. So, using frameworks like this to develop legally feasible blue-green infrastructure networks that actually brings the idea of commoning to its truest sense, not just designated open spaces, but commons as a behavioral aspect, not just as a spatial aspect, becomes crucial in every city. And when, especially in the looking at the ecological fragility and the imbalances of development, this binary that one assigns to environment and development, urban and rural, needs to be broken through the idea of commoning. And commoning merely not just defined from a property that is waiting to be assert for whatever reason, for whatever use, whether it is public or private. So it is not just a site of consumption, but a site of continuous inhabitation by both human and non-human systems. So the idea is to be able to re-establish the everyday of the landscape in a way that actually serves the greater common good. And I think I'm right on time. I shall stop the presentation now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohan sir, for this presentation, and definitely kind of showing us that as special designers how the study of the land and the socio-cultural and social ecological studies can inform and be part of our design, even if you want to look beyond the boundaries and take it ahead. So thank you so much, and we'll get back during the question answer. We move on to our third speaker, the last speaker for the session, Ria. Yeah, hello. Ria is a landscape architect trained at Harvard Graduate School of Design on the Dean's Merit Scholarship. She has held positions at UK Berkeley, UPenn, Wageningen University, researching landscape, climate, climate resilience, and indigenous studies. She has taught design for over a decade at KRVIA, C, UOU, Amsterdam, and CEPT. Ria's work intervenes along all ecological scales, resulting in multi-species congruent explorations of art, furniture, architecture, and landscape. She believes in design that emerges from kinship, reciprocity, and a becoming with the Sylvan. Her design and research studio, Aranya Design, hopes to radically muddy its rural industrial surroundings with wildness and indigenous practices. Over to you, Ria, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Maithili. And thank you for inviting me. I have big shoes to fill from both the presentations before me. It's hard acts to follow, but so so thankful and grateful to be on the stage uh, with all of you. Just a second. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. Right. Sorry, can just someone tell me if they can see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, when I got this sort of brief to speak about traditional knowledge, I was in a bit of a quandary because, um, you know, like all of us that dabble in academics, um, like to critique everything that comes to us. And in part, the question is, what is traditional? What is knowledge? How do we, frame this? What's the sort of space that we think about and work in? And so I titled this lecture or this talk of sorts is experiments in traditional knowledge, and was just thinking through how we think about indigenous knowledge systems in our practice and framing where that sort of emerged from for me personally, and then where it sort of evolved as within the practice. So, the genesis of working with indigenous knowledge for me really started during my master's. So I won a travel grant to study mist and fog systems in southern India, and I ended up showing up in Biligiri Ranga, which maybe both Rushika and Mohan are familiar with because it's very close to Bangalore. And I spent much of this, very relaxed sort of research time on this summer grant, living in Biligiri Ranga, which is inhabited by the indigenous Soleka people. It's sort of their jungle. Um, and in this sort of time, I'd really come to appreciate my walks with Nenje Gowda. And Nenje Gowda was my translator slash guide. He was Sulika. He spoke definitely more words in Latin then in the forms of names of trees and plants we'd encounter, because he had shown around a lot of sort of people from ATRI and other institutes trying to study the ecology of the place. He spoke far more Latin than he spoke English, but our time was always bathed in this sort of warm silence, and he had this very quiet and welcoming disposition with a really easy smile, and both of us loved walking through the forest. It made for really great exploring company, and there was this moment where I seized this opportunity of that this panoramic view on a hike to hunt for honey offered, to sort of ask, attempt to test the new sort of Sulega words that I had learned. And so, gesturing to this hamlet that you could see in the distance, which I knew was his, I said Poru, which I had come to understand as the word for village in Sulega. And, and then, I said, your Podu is here and my Podu is in Tigra in Gujarat. And then, was beaming with this sort of self-satisfaction of having learned this new word. And his response really caught me by surprise, because for the first time in all of these weeks, I saw that he seemed really uncomfortable, and I saw a hint of lack of composure. And he sort of responded saying, you live in a village, not a podu, right? And then in these sort of broken yet what seemed to me very certain words, he proceeded to describe that the podu is a place of the jungle, and it's not fixed in location, it's not fixed in the people that inhabit it, but it's really an occupation of time. And it's ecological and social relationality that stays consistent rather than the geography or the place. And effectively for the Suleka people, a Podu is surrendering to Gorukana, which is their principle of the interconnected web of life, or the call of the jungle. And as I sought to understand his agitation, I tried to inhabit the differences that were so obvious to him at that point, but was still not quite legible to me. But this required a fairly paradigm shift in the constructs of self, of relationships, of environment, of ecology, of time, of space, and particularly of form. And so, this conversation with Nenjigada then evolved into a thesis that aimed to present the cosmology of the Suleka and understand the agency that they called the jungle. And then it tried to understand the Suleka's jungle as an alternative proposition to the colonial and extractive geopolitical entity that we know as forest. And it's sort of a paradigm of ecological conservation that acknowledged the jungle. I mean, it's the paradigm of ecological conservation that really acknowledged the role of human and non-human cohabitation and the agency of the landscape itself. And it sort of, extended to understand how the jungle operates in time rather than in space, in material rather than in abstraction, and in practice rather than process. And lastly, it looked to I examine the alternatives that the jungle offers designers as a landscape of temporal complexity and interspecies coexistence. And this idea of landscape as emergent, of trying to design within practices rather than designing in final forms, is really the heart of what I think of as indigenous knowledge. And we've continued through the body of work to work with indigenous communities and to look toward indigenous cosmologies and ontology as a means to decolonize our own understanding of landscape and of design, moving and hoping to move away from this desire to demand materials to conform to a certain predisposed idea of form, and rather move towards a wild, entangled, rooted form of lively design that emerges from place and from ecology rather than from a predisposed idea of aesthetic form. So and then here I also want to present the sort of ways that we think about indigenous cosmology and indigenous knowledge and the ways that we interact with it. So the first, of course, is to document. The second is to politicize, because very often we find ourselves, and we have to check ourselves often from doing this also, that we romanticize a certain idea of traditional and vernacular, and we think of the traditional as not contemporary. We think of the vernacular as not modern, right? We think of the traditional as correct. A lot of things that actually hide the systems behind these words, and hide both the disparities, the uh, as well as the sort of really broad and diverse set of ideas that we call traditional, essentially, right? And so politicizing that, and putting it in context, and recognizing that there aren't these dualities, that in fact this traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge is not simply a way of using form, but it's really an ontology, or a larger idea of being, a paradigm of existing, and of designing that sees itself, manifest in the kinds of forms that we see as a result of this. Um, there's a part of us that works on like a part of our work is to represent what we learn through indigenous cosmologies, but very mindfully we acknowledge our positionality in this representation, and very much only represent our understanding of indigenous knowledge, and not really, we don't, sort of think that we suppose that we actually know or have the position to represent what it actually is, but rather just our understanding and our inspirations of it. And finally, just ways to sort of reimagine what that indigenous knowledge manifests as, in terms of form, in terms of our design process, in terms of projects. And so this really forms the heart of how we engage with indigenous knowledge within our practice. Um, and we sort of do a really wide variety of work within the firm, which was sort of mentioned in my bio as well. But we're really a multidisciplinary firm, and we work with art research, we work with landscape, with design of everything ranging from small objects to working on urban design plans for larger cities, or climate resilience and disaster response at a far larger scale. So in some of these projects that really the sort of close engagement with indigenous knowledge emerges, I've highlighted a few here to sort of also represent the sort of variety of that exists within our practice. So one of these, and I will talk about some of these in more detail later. So the first is the Wild Food, festival, and there's no order to this. I'm just saying the first. But the Wild Food Festival, which was really an event in Palghar, and this worked with both documentation and politicization. The mango tasting, which was again an event that worked with these. The Shifting Paradigm Studio, which was a studio that we conducted both in different formats, both at CEPT as well as C. The Drawing on Wetness research, which was conducted in partnership with the University of Pennsylvania. The Valsad Lacustrine Community Archive and book. This was worked on with a grant from the Global Resilience Partnership, and then a whole bunch of sort of private projects, which are the Agrocell House, that works in Kutch, Ambavni, which works with the Western Ghats and the Kokna community there. The Mango Tree House that again worked with the Dubla community here, and the APML project, again the Dubla community in Valsad, where I am from. Can We Become Nomadic, which worked with Rabari, which is an art project worked on through a grant from the Al Circle Arts Foundation, also presented there as a showcase. And we worked with Rabari communities from Kutch and Kathiawar, but primarily Kathiawar. So I'll start with the Wild Food Festival. So this really emerged as a collaboration with Locavore and Triple O Farms. which are both sort of NGOs working with food, and we have a deep interest in how in food, both eating and in thinking about how it is grown and it is made and the effects it has on landscape. So we looked at Palghar in northern Maharashtra, northern western Maharashtra, where we worked with the Kukna and Kukni communities there to document all of the wild monsoonal vegetation, seasonal vegetation that they harvest or they forage from the forest, and the recipes that come with it. As a result, we had both an event that showcased a lot of these foods. We worked with the chefs. This was Locavores part to play, but they worked with a lot of chefs to create a pop-up that utilized some of these materials. And what we focused on was really the research of documenting each of these materials in different parts of the season, writing about what their values are, but also creating a little bit of a guide, suggesting when they grow, when they can be foraged, how how abundantly available they are, completely eliminating from this little guidebook on foraging anything that we felt was too endangered to actually forage. If it was no longer found in the forests easily and tribal communities didn't have much access to it, we sort of just didn't put it in here, because we wanted to kind of ensure that we're not too strongly altering systems by creating these little guidebooks on how to harvest. Through the course of that project, we realized a couple of things. One, that a lot of the indigenous communities that we worked with both feel this lack of being able to forward this knowledge or document and then send forth this knowledge to their children, who no longer spend their days with them but often spend a bulk of their days in school. And also in this sort of sense that even within this space, what we were documenting was really just skimming the surface of this larger body of indigenous knowledge about plants, right? For instance, in Palghar, we realized that there is a certain order in which you eat in the monsoonal veggies or greens that are harvested. And if in that cycle of eating 36 sort of different forage greens, if in the cycle you miss out on eating one of those, you kind of stop eating the rest for the season, because according to this indigenous sort of wisdom, if you don't eat the ones that come earlier in the season, your stomach's not ready, your gut does not have the microbiome it requires to digest the ones that come after. And that kind of intricate deep knowledge is just so difficult to come by in one go. And so then we conceptualized the Valsad Lacustrine zine. So our studio is based out of a small village in southern Gujarat, and we're mostly remote, but come here to do our experiments. And so in our district, every village has a lake, so to speak, or a low-lying area that fills with water. And again, there's a lot of indigenous knowledge about the maintenance of these low grounds, about the kind of things that grow there, the seasons in which they grow, and the ways that they are harvested, foraged, used for medicines or used for food or used for nutrition. And through the course of the making of the zine, we sort of first did a lot of research and a lot of drawings, worked with the community and in order to kind of document part of the knowledge, and then which resulted in this book called Paravartan, which began with a small story that spoke about the one of the stories from the village, a cosmological story about the genesis of the village, and then followed up with all of these exercises that tied the ecological, EVS, environmental science education, that the kids were studying in government school with all of the stuff that they were seeing outside. Some of the activities asked for the students to, for instance, document a plant that they have found, draw on that section, all of the different plants that they see and that they know how to name, and the things that are on their plate and what they eat and recipes. And we essentially thought of the book and the exercise book as an act of having the community self-document and self-archive their knowledge, as well as creating a sort of sense of pride and a sense of connection between the knowledge systems that they grow up with and the knowledge systems that they learn in school. And so this was one of, like a project that spanned over 2 years. We did 2 iterations of giving out the books with local government schools and documented a whole bunch of local knowledge, mostly in Gujarati. But it was really a sort of lesson in learning both how to work with community, but also how knowledge differs and changes, in as much as village to village. And then, I'll talk a little very briefly about Can We Become Nomadic, which was a research project undertaken as a part of Al Circle Arts Fellowship and Grant. And here we worked with, Natasha and I worked with communities, Rabari communities or camel herders from Kathiawad. We stayed with them on camp, spent a lot of time traveling with them, trying to write about and learn about their understandings of coast and of climate change, and the ways that they form resilience through their bonds with their animals, and through these multi-species communities that they come together with. As a result, we again produced a series of zines, but also a book that spoke about pastoralism and mobility as an act of care, and sort of framed the ways that Rabari communities view multi-species relationships, understand and think about the coast and about their own mobility through these spaces as acts of care for the landscapes that they temporarily inhabit. It resulted in a series of 3 zines for the presentation and for our show, which were called How to Cook in the Dark, How to Milk a Camel, and How to Walk the Coast. And this is just a glimpse from the final exhibit that we put together there. And then I'll speak very briefly and quickly about a couple of projects that we worked on, where we worked both with indigenous knowledge systems, but also we're trying to work more closely with indigenous materials, indigenous practices of form making, and thinking about, what are the ways that we can reimagine them, rather than just document or interpret or represent them. So the first one was a landscape for a factory, actually, that's within GIDC. One of the inherent conversations that we had with the indigenous communities whose lands these were before the GIDC took them over, was really a conversation about thresholds and about what it means to have these sort of spaces of gathering that are not just spaces of gathering, but are spaces of growth. And so as a result of that, we programmed this. It was a very small sort of stretch of the front part of a large industry, but we carved out a space that was just open to access, that was between the sort of closed off parts of the gate and the completely public street. And in that space, we created a little garden as well as a little forest of native species. The walls that you see here, and I really should update the photographs here, but these walls were drywall construction, again, something that the indigenous community here is very good at doing, made with local basalt that's quarried less than 3 kilometers away. And what we worked with them to do was rebuild an old system of drywalling, where there is a large amount of soil that actually holds the drywall together. And in that, we planted a whole bunch of ferns, a whole bunch of creepers, and a banyan, all of which now have grown over this wall and have sort of taken over the wall completely. But this is just, that sort of space that becomes both kind of partition through the landscape, but also creates little spaces, interstitial spaces to sit and be in before they come through. Another project that we worked very closely with the local community for was called the Mango Tree House, and it was the house and the landscape surrounding it for a small private residence in a local village. And there were two sort of like big learnings that we've had through the construction and through the process of working with the local community and their building techniques. And of course, we also had Hunashala coming to make all of the sort of rammed earth walls and things like that. But one of the key bits for this project was that we wanted the project to be centered around the trees. And so, the entire house sort of builds around this, is built on and amongst this mango orchard, and all of the spaces kind of work with the mango trees. One of the key sort of like interesting things that we picked up, and that we worked with as a crafting practice from the indigenous communities, was really mapping without actually digging the mango roots, and building within the load bearing, basalt walls and foundation walls, these sleeves to let the roots go through. And we had to work very closely with this, again, this sensibility of drywalling, because you could not seal off in concrete the root, it then can't grow. So you had to create a sleeve that was large enough in the rock to allow the plant roots to go through, while using, a dressed like cemented concrete everywhere around it, which was really one of the big learnings. Another thing that we worked with the community here to do was foraging for the materials of the roof, which are all made out of invasive prosopis juliflora that takes over a large part of the surroundings. And so that became, again, working with the prosopis, learning how to straighten and iron it out, and how to create a sort of roofing material from it, was something that we worked very closely with indigenous communities to do. And I'm just going to end here, because I'm thinking this was meant to be a 15-minute talk, but I also maybe just want to add perhaps just one bit here, which is to really say that with indigenous knowledge and within indigenous knowledge systems, the one thing that we have been really sort of focused on and trying to work with is rather than just the crafting, which is a very easy go. And I can see that as we, even as a self-critique, I can see as we go towards projects that seems to be the easiest thing to fall toward. But really, it's that question of asking if we can allow for the idea of the jungle to return. The idea that landscape should be emergent, that instead of demanding for a certain kind of form, we can ask the jungle what it wants to be, and allow for it to happen. Indigenous paradigms that we've worked with across all of these geographies sort of frame landscape as this undivided, undividable even continuity, and really allow for all inhabitants to become active designers. And they, hint that we have sort of emerged from a lineage of designing that allows for the design of identity of the environment from within us. So it's almost as if the environment can speak through us. And this work of designing through encounter, of recognizing natural processes of morphology, and sort of designing for every stage of life's specific conditions to emerge, that's sort of been what the crux of us trying to operate in spaces has always been, and trying to reject this idea that you have monolithic landscape idea, or and shift instead to this pulsing time that allows for landscapes to constantly be dynamic, to change tremendously through the course of their lives, and to never be a complete and finished project. And again, for us, this idea of indigenous knowledge has been rooted in allowing for a trans-species intimacy, a recognition of others as part of self, across skin separations, across inside and outside, across built and unbuilt, but also this sort of a glimpse of an assemblage, of a common collaborative life on Earth. And that's, as sort of grand as that seems, is really what we hope to achieve through the practice, but also has been a constant learning through the indigenous knowledge systems that we've engaged with. Thank you. I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Ria, for this, for taking us through your diverse explorations in kind of capturing and working with the indigenous communities. We are already at uh, 8:20 p.m. and we literally have very limited time to conclude and take a few questions which are in the comment section. Um, I think we can pick one question each for each of us speakers and then move towards concluding. Yeah. So we have question for Rushika. Can I request all the panelists to switch on their cameras? Thank you. Yes, Rushika, was there any reference site completely undisturbed, unaffected by human-induced use or abuse? What are the maintenance and social acceptance issues when the wild parrot is adopted in an urban setting? There's a question coming in from uh, the social handle is seen here. We don't see the name, so yeah.
So definitely, I think that there are not many landscapes that are left without any influence of humans. So we visited a lot of hills, we visited a lot of places, and you can see traces of induced forest fires. You can see traces of grazing. You can see traces of lopping. And I think this is inevitable, especially in our growing landscapes, in urban landscapes. But there was a lot to learn from that as well. So in Jaligere Hills, where we visited boulder savanna landscapes, we saw species that could withstand strong forest fires, that were resurrecting, that were green, that were sturdy in the stone, in the heat, in the drought. And we kind of use those kind of learnings back again to design our urban gardens. Because the intention of this, when we look at rewilding cities today, is to also reduce the amount of resources that we are putting into our gardens today. So how can we learn from these kind of ecologies that are relatively less managed, and how can those learnings inform the design of our gardens, especially in terms of the plant materials?
Thank you.
And in terms of maintenance, yes, I think these gardens do require a lot of upkeep, but the resilience is what we're going for. So there would definitely be certain, you know, certain kind of curation of your plant species. So we're also looking at species that are not very competitive, that do not take over landscapes, that do not spread very quickly. So we're also looking at cuttings. We're also looking at plants that have very aggressive seed dispersal. So for the urban context, we are doing a very strong indexing that can work, especially in our balconies, terraces. So we're looking at urban niches. We're not looking at the scales that Ria and Mohan sir have also been talking about, but we're looking at very small garden-like spaces. And our intention is to change the plant material, because what we're using today is probably not something that for our future is something that we can be sustaining in the long run. Yeah.
Thank you. Uh, there's a question for Mohan sir. Can you please explain detailed analysis, how your detailed analysis
Yeah.
reflected in the master plan decisions? Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Within, of course, the given time, one can not go into all the details of the processes, but to put it very simply, the learnings that one had when looking at the larger landscape, which, like I mentioned, was extremely vulnerable to flows of water, being the delta, but also equally vulnerable to extreme weather events. So there is the issue of climate change, extreme weather, as well as traditional inhabitation of the land. All of that brought together a certain way in which land has been crafted. I mentioned this word, it was not created in the way of a reclamation way, but has been crafted over the years. We adopted a similar method I would say, an abstraction of this method. One cannot copy and compress something that happens over hundreds of years into a couple of years, but you are abstracting that process in a way that actually allows gradual inhabitation of the land. So in this case, it is not the site or the land as a tabula rasa that the architect will build on, but something that is very carefully curated through the flows of water. So here it is the opposite. It is the absence of water that creates the land, and not that what land is not occupied left over for water. So this is the process in which the actual master plan developed, where the master plan is not defined by infrastructure or buildings, but by the actual creation of masses of land within a very fluid landscape. I hope that answers it, but of course there's a lot more technicality one can go into this.
Thank you. Um, I think we can take a question for Ria as well. Can you elaborate on the politicized part of your process and how it reflected in design decisions?
So, yeah, thank you for that question. It's a great one, because it's probably one that I think about the most. But really, it's that question of saying that, I studied architecture before studying landscape architecture, like a lot of us in India did, and my sort of engagement with traditional knowledge systems through architecture was always very form based, or at best with a craft based idea, but it didn't sort of account for multiple things, um, like the sort of disenfranchisement of all, for instance, tribal people or Dalits within this idea of what the traditional or the vernacular is, right? That not accounting for a diversity within what we call traditional, the co-opting of certain crafts without the kind of conditions that and the people that make them. And so in terms of how it evolves, it gets reflected in our design decisions, is mostly trying to ensure that at any given point of time we are not, for instance, doing something like taking a material practice but not ensuring that the craftsman is highlighted in it, ensuring that there is a certain kind of agency that we allow the, or rather an agency that we make room for, so that that expression is not entirely driven by us, of that material practice, but comes from the craftspeople we're working with or from the traditional wisdom that we're operating with. So to give you an example, with the mango tree house, the offsets of the house changed a lot based on what findings on site were. When we got the people that build these, sort of do the stone masonry, up from Dharampur, their ideas of, they had a much better sense of how mango trees grow because they had grown up around them, and the offsets that we left changed dramatically after their suggestion that we shouldn't work with, like, go too close to this, right, in order to ensure that the sleeves get made. Or we ended up creating a lot of curved forms to account for, which we didn't think were essential, but a big part of the house ended up having curved retaining walls or curved sort of foundation walls, because they said that that would be stronger in the masonry, in the dry masonry sections that were left for the roots to go through. And so I think those are the ways that, that's one of the ways that we think about the politicization. And another way is trying to encourage for that paradigm of land, and of, or rather the lack of a paradigm of land in its ideal way coming in. And I saw some of this in Mohan sir's work as well. But can we create some portion of commons when we design? Is there a way to be truly egalitarian about the kinds of public spaces we design? Because very often in the most sort of finished and defined and programmed public spaces, they're exclusionary. They leave out the multiplicity of programs that you will otherwise see in, say, a Maidan. So is there a way to encourage not just the standard process of, not just work with the forms, but also work with programming in a way that makes sense for a local for a local use? Is there a way for us to not define spaces according to gender, or keep boundaries open, allow for a multiplicity of use, even if we don't actually like that use? If the lawn is going to be used, for instance, for a Ganesh festival, it may not be what we imagine it for, but it also means that it accounts for a indigenous system that we should actually be designing for. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we can take up one common question for, and anyone of you can answer. Um, with India having nature sensitive environments that contrast with high density built environments, how do you approach the collection of tangible data like EI? Environment assessment?
If you want me, I can take a stab at it. But
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
it is an important question, but also fairly broad ranging, because one is that the context is extremely diverse and complex, which is one of the challenges when we actually try to create regulatory frameworks in countries like India, because even a simple thing that addresses the issue of water as a resource or land as a resource, their implications can be very different in the cold deserts like a Ladakh to a hot desert like Rajasthan to a tropical wetland like Bengal. So the, the diversity creates challenges, but equally so, it also creates good opportunity to create very systemic thinking, where the data is not one single set that's driven by a national standard, but it is very specific to each region. So, if in case you're interested, you can actually look at all the state level environmental impact assessments or disaster management uh, assessments that's created by varied bodies across multiple scales and multiple hierarchies. Uh, and of course, India has probably the longest running continuous data on environmental conditions, including the meteorology anywhere on the planet. So that way, we've been very lucky with the clarity of the data that's available. Whether that remains accessible to everyone else, that's a different question.
thank you. Anyone else also wants to respond to it? Otherwise, we can move ahead. Okay. So I think we are on time and we shall conclude the session here. What I can see from all the presentations, the common thread is that definitely all these works do require a time and a pace that is maybe relatable to the landscape process and may not play in sync with the pressures that other professions are which we deal with, and we are in constant negotiation with the timelines and the pressures coming from the work environment that we always work in, and versus to pause, understand, observe the and to understand the land better and bring out these mappings so that they can determine our approaches towards design. So I think this kind of uh, dilemma where one thing to understand, I mean, to work in this way needs a certain pace, and there are other professional pressures as well. So this may need maybe, I don't know, we may not have direct solutions to it, but we may need a collaborative work practices maybe which kind of feed into each other so that it can these approaches can come to the convention uh, practice as well. So I think with that, I would like to really thank all the panelists for their time and sharing their wonderful work with all of us. I would also like to take this opportunity to once again thank IFLA-APR on behalf of ISOLA to having given us this opportunity to curate the session, and the participants who have been continuously sending in messages, and uh, these are the witness to how well these talks were received. And thank you so much for engaging. And with this, we conclude the session. Have a good evening, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good day.